We're now going to go into session 4, which we've titled Critical Considerations. And we're going to have two speakers, Lord David Willetts and Dr. Owen Williams. And then we will have a wind-up where Ron Barnett will bring everything together. But in between, after the two speakers, we'll have, again, a short discussion. So it gives me great pleasure to invite David Willetts to give his talk on how is the character of the university changing.
Speak to this conference. I'm only sorry that I missed the morning session because I was away at another event. But I'm very much looking forward to an exchange with Dr. Owen Williams as well. But let me just begin by setting the scene. How is the character of the university changing? Well, I guess it is a kind of reasonable question to start with the question, changing from what? And what have been the anxieties in the past? There never was a golden age of the university as a self-governing academic community without external pressures. One of the classic exchanges on public policy and the role of universities was when Oxford and Cambridge, at their low point in the mid-19th century, having been completely taken over by a very inward-looking group of fellows, Gladstone, needless to say, decided that they needed reform and proposed to set up outside commissions, and the commissioners would go in, work out what was wrong with Oxford and Cambridge, and lick them into shape. Disraeli opposed the measure, and though we don't reach these parliamentary heights today, I recognise the exchange more 170 years later. So in 1854, Disraeli opposed Gladstone's reforms. You will have much to answer for if you place the universities of this country under the control of the state. I believe that is the great point at question, and I cannot understand how gentlemen opposite, though they may be university reformers, and though they may be extremely anxious to see great changes, especially in the University of Oxford, for reasons that may influence them, I cannot understand how they can consent to obtain such results at so costly a price as to place a university, which of all institutions should be independent and free, under the control and management of the state. That was Disraeli's attack, and then Gladstone defends himself. The bill recognised, he said, the necessity for parliamentary interference, the wisdom of using the instrumentality of a commission for conducting and regulating that interference, and the necessity for the interests of the university itself of providing that the commissioner should be armed with sufficient legal authority to give effect to the views of the legislature. These are the real principles on which this bill has been framed. It will, above all things, be an emancipating measure. It emancipates the university from the influence of institutions which of itself it has no adequate power to correct, which came upon it from an extraneous source and from which it is but fair that the power of the state should relieve it. It emancipates in like manner the colleges of fetters which they cannot of themselves undertake to break, bound as they are by conscience in many cases and by strong social and personal influence in others. So that was the exchange in 1854, and Gladstone won that argument, and the commissioners did go in to Oxford and Cambridge, and they reorganised the endowments, they rationalised the professorships, and some of our most historically resonant professorial titles from Oxford and Cambridge, Waynflete professors and such like, were invented by the commissioners in the 1840s to give a veneer of medievalism to a great Victorian reforming project. So these arguments go on, and if I jump forward from 1854, I jump forward 90 years to that wonderful short book by Bruce Truscott, Red Brick, in which he first uses the term red brick. The civic universities, we now know he was referring to the Red Brick of Liverpool, where he was an academic, there he wrote under a nom de plume. And the Red Brick is an attack on all those civic dignitaries and their role in the governance of universities. So now we rediscover and celebrate the civic university. His book is an attack on them, how ludicrous it is that before you can appoint a new professor of Spanish, local councillors have to be convened in session in order to give their approval. So his is an attack on local interference in civic universities. I'm an honorary fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford, and where I last saw Michael Crick the other week. And one of the great historians, social scientists there, A H Halsey, then he wrote his book, Decline of Donish Dominion, where he argued that post-war public funding had liberated universities from control by civic dignitaries. So public expenditure had been a liberation, but that increasingly strings were being attached and Donish dominion was in decline. And although that is a very lively British debate, it is by no means exclusively British, and in many ways I think it is conducted with greater depth and greater sophistication in Germany. Of course, the German debate around the origins of the modern university with great thinkers Fichte, Hegel, Humboldt, and Kant's conflict of the faculties, probably the great single account of the case for an autonomous university, or at least an autonomous philosophy faculty within a university, written in response to a letter that he received from the King of Prussia, complaining about what he was teaching and asking that he should desist. And he writes back, he writes an account of the autonomy of the university. And in the course of it, he makes a parallel which is relevant to what I'm going to come on to in a moment, the question of marketization and neoliberalism. Surprisingly, he was one of the first German thinkers to take the Scottish Enlightenment seriously. So he engages, just as he engages with David Hume in his wider philosophy, he engages with Adam Smith, whose Wealth of Nations has a powerful critique of universities, and mischievously describes the different faculties as an excellent example of specialization of labor, and then describes the university case for autonomy in the following words. A minister of the French government summoned a few of the most eminent merchants and asked them for suggestions on how to stimulate trade. An old merchant said, "Build good roads, mint sound money, give us laws for exchanging money readily, etc. But as for the rest, leave us alone." Classic neoliberal statement. And Kant goes on, if the government were to consult the philosophy faculty about what teachings to prescribe for scholars in general, it would get a similar reply. Just don't interfere with the progress of understanding and science. And so Kant wrestled with all these issues, and I do think still that German debate is probably the most sophisticated, and he produces a classic account of the role of the university, and as part of Germany's tragedy, if you want a low point, I guess it is Heidegger's 1933 Rector's Address, which is really trying to interpret the German tradition and place it in what we can only regard as a fascist context. And then probably the greatest mischievous critique of these ideas of the university, which I reread, because it is so enjoyable in preparation for this event, the Jacques Derrida essay, Moklos, or The Conflict of the Faculties, which is his brilliant, intelligent mockery of the Kantian idea of the university. So this debate has been going on, and there is no perfect authoritative statement of the humanistic classical idea of university, and the exchanges have gone back and forth. But when people ask about the character of the university today and how it's changing, there is one obvious candidate, and it's sometimes referred to as marketization or neoliberalism, and sometimes my own policies when I was the Minister for Universities and Science are cited as an example of all this. So let me just briefly touch on and engage with all that. First of all, my view is that the English university system, is a very unusual one if you compare it with other European university systems. It is historically a choice-based system. Choice at both ends. Students choosing which university, and indeed, because of its historical origins, which college to apply for, and universities choosing who to admit. We do not realise how unusual a model this is. There are many other systems with a national standard school-leaving exam, above which, if you get a certain mark, you are entitled to a place at university. There are many countries with a civic university with an obligation to take on local people if they get above a certain grade in an exam. And of course, and I describe in the opening chapter of my book on universities, the extraordinary power which Oxford and Cambridge used to suppress the creation of civic universities in England. By 1800, there were 25 universities in Germany, about 25 in France and Italy. But Oxford and Cambridge suppressed the creation of new universities to maintain a duopoly for 600 years. So we created colleges when the rest of Europe was creating civic universities. And that in turn means it's also part of the English system. You go away from home to go to university because you don't have a university in your local town or city. This is a highly mobile, choice-based system and unusual, but it is our tradition. And in a way, what institutionalized it was the creation of UCAS in the late 1950s, which is a massive choice engine, a massive arrangement for matching up young people making a choice where they want to go to universities and universities deciding where to go. As so often in history, one wonders what would have happened if instead of UCAS being created before Robbins, it had been created post-Robbins. It may have been done on a different model, but UCAS is essentially an Oxbridge application process multiplied many times over. So in other words, that is historically how things have been done in England. We have had something much closer to a choice-based quasi-market model than almost any other European country. And the funding flows, of course, historically were fees. So the funding flows went with the student, to the college that the student had chosen, and the college that had chosen to accept the student. And successive reforms, and over the last 20 years, we've had 3 main reviews, and we've had 6 different prime ministers. By and large, we've all ended up with a model in which the money has increasingly, explicitly, once again, gone with the student to the university they choose. But now, thank heavens, and without the student paying up front, but in the repayment model. And what I did was increase the vivid transaction of the student bringing the money because the fee was a lot higher, and that the fee had to go up because the public expenditure in the grant form was going down. I've tried to get more information out about the performance of universities so that it was a more informed choice. And of course, hovering in the background, and people like Michael Shattuck have written about this, behind this there is indeed a contract to deliver a service. The fees and loans model, though it's not really a commercial arrangement, is also a contract to deliver a service. And I personally thought this was bringing in the new world to redress the balance of the old. I actually wanted that kind of contract to get universities to focus once more on their obligations, their teaching obligations, and what they could offer their students. Now, I made a series of mistakes in that process. I spoke of price competition as if that was both going to happen and would be desirable. It didn't happen, and it wouldn't have been desirable, because as soon as you have a system where people aren't really paying up front, they're repaying when they have earnings above a certain amount in the future. The idea of someone saying, I'm going to York because it's 8,250 and it saves me £500, because if I went to Leeds it would be 8,750. That was a sort of ludicrous misunderstanding of how the system would actually work. So that was a mistake. I did, although the OFS was not created in my time, we had HEFKI. I did see that as grant funding declined and we moved increasingly to a student fees and loans model, you would no longer essentially have the grant-giving power of HEFGI as the informal, discretionary, regulatory body. You would need to have a more explicit, rule-based and transparent regulator, the Office for Students, which we now have. But I do hear loud and clear a lot of unhappiness from the higher education community about how it works. Sometimes it is objections simply to apparent discourtesy, people who just wish the communications were not quite so hostile. I think there is a genuine frustration that people don't get enough constructive advice from OFS. It has become so arm's length. It turns up and assesses. It doesn't contribute to a discussion about how a university can tackle all the challenges that universities face nowadays. And I think there are too many interventions. There's too many ministerial letters to the OFS and then too many OFS letters out to universities, where it'd be far better if there were a much more disciplined and narrow focus on certain specific priority issues. So I briefly touched on some of the history of the debate, the fees and loans model. Where next? And just let me conclude, therefore, with 3 or 4 observations about where I think we may be going. One of the perversities of the system was that I always thought we had, if anything, in teaching, we had insufficient information and insufficient pressure, including competitive pressure, to focus on teaching and offer a high-quality teaching experience. Whereas on the research side, a system much more shaped by university academics themselves, we had a system that was hyper-competitive and extremely individualistic, entirely focused on the papers attributed to an individual academic. So it ended up with if anything, I inherited a very neoliberal research funding arrangement and a rather communitarian, collectivist teaching arrangement. And I thought it would be a good idea to have a little bit more competition on teaching and actually ease up a bit on the hyper-competitiveness of the research funding model. And if you look at the latest proposals and their draft, but I do urge you to read them if you've not already done so, from Jessica Corner and Research England on shifts in research funding, you will find a real attempt to break free from a model so focused on the individual academic and his or her papers, to look much more at things like institutional environment, to recognize the value of support staff who may be anything from data scientists to technicians in the lab who help contribute to the research performance of a university. So I think if you look at where the ref is going, I would say a definite pushback against hyper-liberalism. But those decisions are still to be taken, and the consultation will last until November. Next issue on my list, and some of the frustrations I think that the academic community have with the changing character university, is just that they are getting very big. And especially in today's world, if you are a big institution, and by big, we're talking about some universities that now have annual revenues of over £1 billion a year. If you are big, and you are regulated, you need disability policies, and you need anti-discrimination policies, and you need a whole host of policies, many of them for absolutely desirable and good things. But you have a growing managerial cadre administering these very substantial flows of funding. And I think the public debate about universities keeps on going down this blind alley of too many people going, when it's just an observation. If you look across OECD countries, it's a pretty reliable observation that in the last 50 years, almost every year, in almost every country, the number of people participating in higher education grows. And I see no reason why that trend should reverse. And it'll be reinforced in Britain by a mini demographic boom because of the increase in the birth rate in the first decade of this century. So the debate, instead of trying to stop people going to university, I think the really interesting debate is what is going to happen when we see a big increase in the number of university students over the next 10 years. If we do nothing about it and remain in this state of denial that the growth is going to happen, we will end up with very big universities. The only way these people will be absorbed is by universities becoming even larger. The alternative model, when you can take the intellectual leap that you're going to have more people going to university, is to start thinking about creating new institutions. And you may find that that is an opportunity to promote diverse missions. You may want to bring in new providers. You may want some individual universities to split up and like a sort of cell multiplying. But I think the interesting question, and that would be an opportunity for experiment with the different characters of universities, including some rather smaller ones than we will have if we carry on as we are. So the second question is how to take the opportunity of growth to have some interesting experiments in the changing character university. Second one. The third one is globalization, and everybody says globalization is going in reverse. British higher education has always had a very odd form of globalization. Very large numbers of overseas students, now reaching 600,000. But very few British students going to study abroad, negligible external flows, unlike most other countries, plus no significant global university chains. There's about 10 university chains, each with several 100,000 students in different countries. There is, despite the reputation of English higher education, there is no globally recognized, globally operational British university chain. And I regret that. And one of the reasons why I had all those experiences with alternative providers, and some of the stuff that emerged at the end was of poor quality, and we needed the regulator to do something about it. I wanted to see some British university chains. I didn't see why. They should be Spanish, Indian, Chinese, American, but Britain stuck, as we always do in so many industries, with a nice little cottage industry model. Although the universities with 30,000 or 40,000 or 50,000 students feel big as individual institutions, there are chains with 250,000 students spread across 10 universities in 3 continents. We've never managed to do that, and I still look forward to the day as I think about how Britain is to pay its way in the world in the 21st century, actually getting serious about creating some really innovative, properly capitalized international higher education chains. I think would be a great thing to do. And then finally, I have to end with culture wars and how universities handle culture wars. Of course, ironically, as one would expect, universities being at the heart of the national intellectual debate, universities are where they begin. And the doctrines that animate the culture wars many of them emerge from American academics, critical race theory, and such like, leading to the belief, I'm trying to report it, and there's a separate moment to get into the substance of this, leading to the belief that language is a powerful tool of oppression, and how you use words is therefore so important, and it has been insufficiently policed, and we need to be very careful in how we use words, and people who use words wrongly are oppressing other people, and therefore need to be policed in a way that complacent, affluent, protected white men have never really recognized as a problem. That doctrine emerges from universities, and it creates pressures on what can be said and should be said, and creates a new set of moral judgments about what can or should be said. So that's where it comes from. But of course, it creates a reaction and a belief that this attempt to make universities the kind of moral advance guard of a new sensitivity about the use of language has meant that universities, instead of being a place for freedom of speech, have become a place where there are massive inhibitions and constraints on freedom of speech. You know, all of you, I'm sure, wrestle with these issues much more closely than I do. And look, and we've just had a long debate on all this in Parliament with the Freedom of Speech Bill. First of all, my starting point is a university is not Speaker's Corner. A university is a community, and it is a legitimate role for university management to shape the way in which freedom of speech is exercised within its institution. And indeed, when you look close up at it, there's a whole host of decisions which seem to me to be legitimate ones, and where it was very hard as we scrutinised the legislation going through Parliament, and I was one of the people trying to amend it, it's very hard to get from the government a view of how whether the OFS was to be absolutist, freedom of speech full stop, or was going to be able to do lots of practical decisions. Okay, you're allowed to have you can have this speaker with rather extreme opinions, but please can we have a neutral chair? Okay, you do have very strong views about Jewish people that have to remain within the framework of the law. But remember, for example, Holocaust denial is not a criminal offence in the UK. Holocaust denial is a criminal offence in Germany. And when the minister responsible went on the Today programme was asked, is Holocaust denial to be allowed in university? She said yes. And within a few hours, number 10 press officers said no. So exactly how these rules are to operate is still not entirely clear. Okay, you want to have a Holocaust denier to speak at this university and they're claiming a right to freedom of speech and it's not a criminal offence, but please don't hold the event in the same place as where the Jewish students celebrate some of their religious ceremonies. Okay, you have strong hostility to gay people, but please can you come and give your speech not during Gay Pride Week? These are all the kind of decisions which real people in universities face every day. And part of the backdrop to the legislation is a loss of confidence in their capacity to take those sorts of decisions, which I rather regret. I think that myself, those are absolutely the decisions which academics and university management need to take as they try to shape the intellectual life of their community. And I think there is a glimmer of hope here, which is that if the universities become a place where people feel that we learn how to handle divergent opinions in a way that probably for many young people they've not had to within their family or within their school. If universities become a place where freedom of speech is exercised, but in a way that is respectful of others, then we may yet find that universities, despite their doctrines having been the origins of the culture wars, also themselves help us to find a way forward through them. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, so I'll invite Rowan Williams now, and then we'll have a discussion at the end.
I'm very grateful indeed for the opportunity of reflecting a bit on these issues with you this afternoon, with a rather limited and perhaps not terribly representative experience of academic governance. I was for a bit on the governing body of what was then the Gwent College of Higher Education in Newport a couple of decades ago, which was part of what got me back into business there as first Chancellor of the University of South Wales 10 years ago. And I was Master of a Cambridge College for 10 years and involved a bit in various aspects of the university's life, including its ethics committee, some of its student well-being work, and a couple of issues around appeals, disciplinary appeals. So a mixed bag, but perhaps indicative of the kind of experience that many of us may have of little fragments of a very, very complex picture. And it's something of the complexity of the processes of governance that I want to talk about very briefly this afternoon. I rather provocatively gave my talk a title referring to cultures of mistrust, because I think that has been part of the climate in the last few decades. A multiple layered mistrust running in several different directions. The mistrust which began to bed itself in British society generally in the 80s towards self-regulating professional bodies generally. The mistrust felt by those self-regulating bodies generally towards the mistrustful government. Mistrust within and between academic institutions, sometimes in an environment of competition, when some aspects of the operation were felt to be under threat, where these words which we've been reminded of and somewhat warned about, like marketization, began to erode trust in the processes of governance. And so what I thought I'd do to begin with was to step back and simply ask about good governance in very general terms, and what we mean by good governance and what we expect it to do. And it seems to me that two things come into focus here. As you'll see, my argument is cumulative. 2 introductory points, 3 points about the components of governance and 4 suggestions about where we might be going. There might even be 5 emerging in discussion later on, who knows. Anyway, 2 basic points. One is, of course, that good governance is about accountability. It's about knowing who to challenge when malpractice occurs. But I'd say it's also about what I'll call the conservation of common interest. Good governance is a process or a set of processes which is designed, negatively speaking, to prevent the improper or disproportionate pursuit of one bit of group interest at the expense of others in any kind of enterprise. And of course, accountability is part of what feeds into that. But positively, good governance has a role in clarifying what I'll call shared interest or properly negotiated diversity of interest within a communal body. Good governance allows interests to be explored, probed, challenged, developed, argued for. And that too is part of accountability, the mutual accountability of a working institution. So those are my 2 basic thoughts about the nature of good governance. It conserves accountability and it guarantees challengeable accounts of interest within the group so that you don't get disproportionate emphasis on a policy which favours one set of interests within the institution rather than others. So, next bit of what I want to think about. In that light, in whose interests do institutions of higher education work? And here are 3 thoughts about that. First of all, blindingly obviously, HE institutions work in the interwoven interests of students and researchers. That's why I'm not cutting that up into 2. I want to talk about interwoven interests. The expectation of a student in an institution of higher education is to be inducted into intellectual practices. In the widest sense of that term, because I don't understand intellectual practices simply to mean writing essays or experimental reports or mathematical exercises. Intellectual practice is the practice of reflection, shared critical reflection. And the student has a proper expectation in entering an HE institution that she or he will be inducted into that practice, and inducted in the company of practitioners, seasoned practitioners. And so the other side of that interwoven complex is that the practitioner needs, in varying degrees, the appropriate kind of space for developing intellectual practice for themselves, including innovative practice that may push the envelope, push the limits of what's currently thought to be acceptable or orthodox. So that's the starting point. There would not be institutions of higher education if there were not that interlocking set of interests, the student's expectation to learn intellectual practice, the seasoned practitioner's expectation of having the liberty, even though this sounds very idealistic, the time to pursue this. Interlocking because the practitioner's encounter with the student and the students with the practitioner is going to be fundamental and even transformational for both parties. And a good, well-working institution of higher education will recognise that. Which is why, to dip a toe into shark-infested waters, ideas of solely teaching and solely research-oriented HE institutions are actually a bit fanciful. You may try to stop a seasoned practitioner teaching, but it's quite hard work sometimes. You may assume that teaching can carry on without any research or innovative thinking, but you'll soon find out just how sterile that can be. So while we can talk about the weighting, W-E-I-G-H-T, the weighting of institutions one way or another, we certainly should not be apartheid-minded about that. Second, there's what I'd call a derivative interest on the part of the student in some convergence in what's going on in the institution with the needs of society. In a word, employability. The student wants to be inducted into intellectual practice, but not simply so as to go on practicing intellectual practice. Intellectual practice is put to work in a variety of contexts, and to have an intelligent account of what society's needs and demands might be is part of the interest that has to be conserved here. But of course, that wider interest in what society is asking needs to be looked at carefully and critically. It involves not being reductive about society's needs, not unduly and institutionally privileging certain kinds of needs over others, and I'll come back to that in a moment. It means not accepting current social valuations of what needs to be fulfilled and how. Some of us, there are a few people I think of my generation around in this room, some of us will remember the days when teaching was assumed to be the default future of pretty well all arts graduates. And while that's a long time ago and a long way away, nonetheless, it was, I think, an interesting reflection of the days when the teaching profession was held in rather higher social esteem than it is now. But it would be rather a pity, I would dare to say, if we were to accept what is so often a low, unimaginative social account, prevailing social account of the importance of the school teacher. It's just by the way, but let's just stay with that idea that the derivative interest of the student in being inducted into intellectual practice is that that should at some point converge with the needs of society in a way that is beneficial for the student. But third, moving on from that, society itself therefore has an interest in having its practices constructively and intelligently interrogated. Society has an interest in having people around who ask constructive questions. Society has an interest in intellectual life. And remember, I'm using that term intellectual life and intellectual practice in a wide rather than a narrow sense, to refer to all those ways in which we helpfully, consistently probe, rediscover, explore, bottom out assumptions that are around. And of course, one of the little ironies in the margin here is that that can mean society's own assumptions about governance and its patterns need interrogation as well, whether that's in local institutional contexts or national politics, part of intellectual practice. And this is what, at any and every level, helps to prevent society simply slipping back into unthought and unchallengeable patterns of power, privilege, and influence. Society has an interest in encouraging critical questioning, in encouraging the probing of its prevailing forms of power and influence. Intellectual practice is, in that sense, something which in turn exists in the interest of a whole society, not simply an elite, which is why it's very proper that, as we've been reminded, universities should be pressed on issues around inclusion, diversity, and equality. And this is not simply fashionable wokeness, it's about what it is in intellectual practice that pushes societies to be more accountable as societies, which prompts people to be more accountable to one another for their exercise of power, which raises the issues of access and universality. So there are my three ideas about the interests that higher educational governance ought to have in mind. The interwoven interests of student and researcher in intellectual practice, the interest of the student, to some extent also the whole institution, in convergence with society's needs, the interest of society in securing constructive intellectual questioning as part of its map. What might be the implications for governance in practice? So, 4 things this time, as I promised, but very briefly. The first thing is the application in this particular context of the general principle of subsidiarity. That's to say, good governance factors in not only accountability, but the question of the right level at which decisions are made about particular things. And the representation of practitioners by practitioners in governance processes is obviously something to do with subsidiarity. Those who are doing it, those who are being inducted in it, researchers, teachers, and students, all obviously have an interest in being represented. And that's something to do with making sure that those who are delivering the fundamental task of the institution are there in governance at its core. The second element about what might be implied here for governance in practice is, of course, the representation of social interests in a very broad frame. We had a fascinating brief interchange earlier this afternoon about who gets represented on university councils and governing bodies, about the relative lack of diversity there at a time when in other contexts diversity is a bit more marked. Some very interesting discussion too about the payment of those who volunteer for this work. But in theory, I would say there is clearly a need for that kind of representation, not simply from one sector of the social environment, but from a very broad range of interested parties, which may include, should include, and does include business, but might also include, as we were reminded, regional or civic government, and might also include the third sector. What would a university governing body look like which actively sought out representation not just from business and finance in the classic ways in order to get the accountancy skills you need, but which also actively looked for other kinds of representation from, as I say, the voluntary world, from those bodies that are concerned with social health and welfare in a rather wider sense. Which brings me to a third element, which I put forward with some uncertainty, because I can see not all, but some of the practical difficulties that might arise. It seems to me that if we want an integrated education system of some sort, then other sorts of educational interest and institution ought to be represented in governance too. What do schools know of the HE institutions they're preparing people for? How does that kind of interest get factored in to governance? I've been involved once or twice over the years with groups that have been working actively with schools in areas that traditionally don't send many people to university. Some of you will know the Into-University network, which has done astonishing work with schools in traditionally deprived areas in London and elsewhere, where from late primary school onward, children in these schools are encouraged to think about and to learn about what a university might look like, what a university experience might be for them. And it's been rather an inspiration to be involved with that. Now, is there some counter-process whereby the interests of those groups are somehow present and represented in governance structures? And then, of course, fourth and finally, there's the question of the representation of funders of various sorts, part of whose task is certainly to keep a check on accountability and value for money. There's no necessary evil in asking about value for money, so long as you know what value means. And such groups are, such parties, such interests are in a good position to monitor the synergy or lack of it between the institution and the wider spread of social need. So in a rather theoretical account of what governance might look like in practice, those are 4 things which are perhaps worth keeping in mind as components of healthy governance. The representation of practitioners by practitioners, the representation of a diverse spread of social interest, the representation of those with different kinds of stake in the broader educational world, the representation of funding authorities, bodies, etc. So those would be my rather sketchily outlined components to put into a map of governance within higher education. And at every point in reflecting on these, it seems to me we need to be pushing back against the prevailing risks of flattening the landscape. Flattening the landscape by restricting how we think about social needs, what I call the convergence of what happens in the institution with the declared needs of society. Flattening the landscape in terms of an unquestioned privileging of certain kinds of employability. When there was much talk about rating universities according to the average salary of their graduates, I remember feeling a great wave of indignation on behalf of my daughter, who is a primary school teacher in North London, and I think had an excellent education at Warwick University. I realise there are those here with connections to that admirable place, and I certainly don't think that the fact that she was earning substantially less than some of her contemporaries as a primary school teacher was any index that Warwick University has somehow failed in its job. We need to resist, I won't use the word marketisation, I take the warnings about using it too glibly and too freely, but we need to resist the notion that we're simply talking about a product transferred from a holder to a student in order to be cashed in the market. The education provided in a higher education institution simply as a kind of luncheon voucher which can be exchanged for something on the far side of the process. And that, I think, at the end of the day, is the real elitism and exclusivism that threatens the university world today. Not the fantasized elitism criticised sometimes in the pages, I wish I could say only of the tabloid press, but I can't, the elitism of academic excellence, but the elitism and exclusivism of privileging certain kinds of valued work at the expense of others in a complex society in what has helpfully been called the ecosystem of education and its governance. We don't want a system in which the diverse intellectual practice of the teacher, the carer, the creative, the consultant, the experimenter, where that diversity is ignored. Good governance, perhaps of the sort I've outlined here, is one of the key ways in which, when it's working well, we can avoid the danger of ignoring that living diversity. Thank you very much.
Hi, it's Susan Bruce. This is a question for David, and his rather provocative characterisation of universities as the origins of the culture wars. Now, I think by my reckoning, we're probably in about the third skirmish in the culture wars, and an important skirmish was in the 1980s in the USA, which was largely focused around feminism and some kind of questions of race, and included sort of hyperbolical allegations that Stanford wasn't teaching Western civilization anymore because it had dropped one text over a year-long course for making way for Toni Morrison or somebody. And those 1980s culture wars actually taught us quite a lot, I think, and they transformed a lot of humanities education in the sense that it would be quite difficult these days, I think, to look at courses in most university humanities departments, in history or English, for example, which didn't have attention to gender and race as part of the syllabus, which it didn't before. Now, the skirmish that we're in at the moment, at the sort of seems to me to be a kind of major new skirmish, and rather a worrying one, in which, to me, it seems that the far right is often weaponising these culture wars to really concerning sort of outcomes and potentialities. Now, in my own institution, I recently kind of devised a new module where I ask students, for example, to read Kimberlé Crenshaw's account of the key collective class action law case of black women workers against a motor company, in order where she invents the term critical race theory. Because I wanted them to see where it had come from and to read it for themselves, rather than encountering this locution, critical race theory, in pejorative ways which don't actually tell them what it actually was and where it had come from. So the question is, David, do you think there are any dangers in saying that universities are responsible for the culture wars?
I think following from the excellent remarks we had from Dr. Rowan Williams, given that universities are operating at the frontier, some of the ideas, it seems to me clearly almost just a historical statement that the ideas that you're describing there did emerge from universities. And most intellectual and cultural movements, certainly of the post-war period, seem to me to have had university origins, which is kind of what we would expect. They're big, significant institutions, which, as we heard, partly exist in order to challenge society. So I do think it's where those ideas originate, tenured academics at places like Berkeley and elsewhere, and indeed having read the Kathleen Stock Material Girls, she tracks some of these ideas. I'm not saying that they are illegitimate or that you don't have a right to set out teach the curriculum in your discipline in that way. I absolutely defend your right to do that. And indeed, one of the points I make to my colleagues in government and in the Conservative Party is that one of the many ironies in Britain and Europe why I don't think culture wars are going to be like America. I don't think we're going to reach that extreme, and I think we have various protections from it. And one of the protections is greater labour market protections. If you have a very lightly regulated labour market, it is easier for an employer to panic or a battle or a crusade to get underway in which you lose your job. Thank heavens, and this is where my thinking about labour market, one of the reasons why my thinking of labour market regulation has changed. Actually, thank heavens, there are a lot of people in academia who still have labour protections, which mean that if they wish to teach in the way you describe, provided it's rigorous and high quality, yes, they should have an absolute freedom to do so.
Yes, sure.
Just a very quick footnote to that. I think one of the ironies about culture wars is that it simply tells us what a very bizarre notion of culture we have, or indeed what absence there is of any serious thinking about what culture means. That's a small thing, but it also tells us that there are some issues which people attempt to resolve by regulation, which are properly resolved by culture, in the sense of what the culture of an institution or a society is. I was glad, David, to hear you talking about the difference between Hyde Park Corner and the university. I think that's actually very helpful. You're talking about the responsibility of somebody in a position of administrative authority in a university having an accountability to all kinds of good, all kinds of security within the institution, which might lead to what some would regard as a controversial decision not to have somebody to speak. And that is a decision about the kind of culture you can and can't maintain within the institution. Absolutizing it, legislating for this, and legislating on what seems to me a hair-raisingly fundamentalist account of free speech is cosmetic, not real politics, I think. So, not actually solving a problem.
Okay. Michael, can you just wait for the mic?
Yeah. Michael Crick, David, you're telling us about how you expect university populations to carry on growing, but universities face huge financial problems, particularly some of the smaller ones. Do you expect universities to merge in this country on a significant scale, and do you think that would be an easy process? And second, do you see perhaps the establishment of new universities in some of the places where they don't have them, say the Yorkshire Coalfield or the west coast of Cumbria, as a part of the levelling up process and the economic regeneration and engines of innovation and regeneration?
Yes, I think there can be mergers. They don't always work. There have been successes and failures. The general view in the community, which I just report, is that, for example, Manchester and bringing UMIS together with the University of Manchester is thought to have been a success. And ironically, again, something I remind people of, including in my own party, in the height of Thatcherism in the mid-1980s, when Cardiff College, one of the Cardiff higher education institutions, was going to go bankrupt. And I was working in the number 10 policy unit at the time. I can remember Kenneth Baker coming in and discussing with Margaret Thatcher what could happen. And the last thing Margaret Thatcher wanted to see happen was a university closing and going bankrupt. And that the new University of Cardiff was created to rescue an institution, and that has worked. So yes, there can be mergers, but I hope there will also be innovative new provision. And that was one of the things which the Robbins report did so well. It took the opportunity of the creation of new universities to try to promote different forms of pedagogy and research. And what was the University of Sussex was going to be Balliol-on-Sea with those 4-year kind of interdisciplinary courses. And I think it's, sadly, after 10 or 15 years, that kind of innovation rather ran out of steam. So I personally, putting my colours to the mast, would like some innovative, different, new types of higher education provision to emerge.
How nice we circled back to that, because that was my question. So how do you see the role of government regulation creating space for this kind of innovative growth? Because what we actually see is that regulators set very strict limitations on what universities look like, and we're exchanging administrators at the highest level across our institutions, and they're all becoming kind of cookie-cutter examples of one another. Also, they're working within the same pressures, right? As we see student number caps going, and so these giant institutions growing, and then institutions in the middle being squeezed, and exposure to international markets and the good and the bad that can cause, right? So you've got a kind of constellation of factors that are pushing institutions in one direction. And so I wonder, what impetus is there for institutions to take the risk to innovate in the ways that you imagine, and I think that many of us in this room would like to see, but can't imagine that the constrictions we're working in will make that possible anytime in the near future.
Well, I have no particular brief for how the OFS operates on that now, and I think it should be promoting diversity and not be a kind of cookie cutter system, in your words. I'm now going to take a slight risk and disagree with something that Rowan Williams said. And that is, when I look at the powerful forces homogenizing universities, One of them is a powerful cultural model that there's one way of being a very good university, and that has research excellence at its heart. And the research-intensive universities are excellent institutions, but I think we have not, and I don't think that a university, to be a university, needs to be a place where research is conducted. I do think you need to be engaging in scholarship, operating at the frontier of your discipline. But there are the sort of, historically, we have had universities with a teaching, predominantly teaching role, and where they, insofar as there's research at all, it is not research which is scored highly in the ranking. So, real example, a university where, of course, it teaches economics, and it teaches economics in the light of contemporary economic theory and practice, but its contribution, apart from educating students and maintaining a body of knowledge, is really good studies of the local economy. Now, that kind of work has really suffered from the way that the research excellence frameworks in successive iterations have said, well, show us the articles that have advanced the boundaries of theoretical understanding of economics and that have been published in economic journal. And for me, as a lay person, if I may use the word, a consumer of university research in the various areas of public policy I work from, it's often the people who've done a review of effective welfare to work interventions. That kind of work is incredibly useful, but it's unlikely to get you published in a prestigious journal if it's not innovative in its use of data and it's not advancing the theory. Now, you could have a very broad interpretation of research, and you could call it research, you could call it applied research, you could call it scholarship, but that is just one example. In my experience, we have such a clear sense of what makes a university a good university that universities doing that type of stuff suffer unfairly.
What you've just described is actually rather how the University of South Wales works. And as outgoing Chancellor of the university, I have no qualms at all about saying that their model is one I regard as admirable and excellent in its way, precisely for those reasons. Such research as is done is largely locally focused. It has a very strong sense of its responsibility to its hinterland, especially in the South East Wales valleys. And I regard that as a good and a valid way of being a university. And one of the things I've said as Chancellor there over the years is there's more than one way of being an excellent university. And that's something which has perhaps been slightly ironed out. But it comes back really to the question, how does government increase that flexibility, that valuation of different styles of excellence? Glad you mentioned Sussex, because that we might go back to, I suppose, to Keele, the old University of North Staffordshire, and its earliest years when there was a very strong emphasis on corporate life as well as intellectual exploration, where the foundation year was pioneered and all those things. Are we capable any longer of that kind of blue sky thinking? Well, doesn't look like it a lot of the time, and I would love to hear more about that, really would. When at Cambridge we were thinking about how we could tackle some of the diversity issues with a sort of introductory year for people from certain backgrounds, we did feel we were up against it in both financial and structural terms, trying to conceive what that might mean, knowing that a lot of the dice were loaded against us in that sort of experimental thinking.
And of course, I mean, those are examples, and I think it was Lindsay from Oxford who then went to Keele with that model in mind. If there are some examples at the moment, I would say what's happening at Hereford with an innovative attempt at different ways of teaching engineering, which had got rather stuck in certain models and which were clearly highly gendered. I think what's going on at Hereford is quite interesting with the creation of a new university there. I have to say, Dyson, higher education institute, also in the area of engineering, two applied discipline, are quite interesting experiments, and and it would be great. And the new college the new college didn't really sort of take off, but a college teaching the liberal arts in the American sense, a liberal arts college overcoming, and here I completely agree with Brian Williams, the problems of early specialisation in English. In the English system, I could see that as a very exciting innovation. And I very much hope that nothing the OFS did would stand in the way of such innovation.
Hi, this is a question for Dr. Williams. I'm Cedric from Cedric Ginstey for King's College London. So, Dr. Williams, you've extolled the merits of a richer intellectual life in eloquent terms. In particular, you stated society has an interest in intellectual life. But I fear that this appetite for intellectual stimulation is not maybe as ubiquitous as us academics we like to think. So from the pulpits of our universities, we have a vested interest really in promoting our services. I feel that this is like other professions or guilds. We are essentially ensuring the growth of our sector. So, but if the appetite for the challenge of the intellect is maybe diminishing, what if society is more interested in TikTok, cats and dogs videos, football? My question is really one of legitimacy. Is it legitimate for us, academics, to claim that society should be better educated?
Thank you. Just for clarity's sake, I suppose, when I talk about interest, I don't mean what people find interesting, but what it is in their interest in the long term. And we're making a bid, I think, in the world of higher education. We're making a bid to persuade society that it is in the interests of society that the particular skills we're invested in should be supported widely in that society. Not so much that we have a mission to make society better educated, but that we have a mission certainly to make society capable of receiving critical questions, because the alternative is a bit worrying. And if it's not done in some context where there is the public accountability that universities have, where does it get done? Where does that honing of sharp questions to what I call existing patterns of privilege and influence, where does that get done? So I understand entirely that it will sound like self-interest. We go out into the public sphere and we say, you know what, all of you really need, if you only knew it, better universities. And people raise their eyebrows, shrug their shoulders and walk on, of course. But we have a longer-term argument to conduct about what makes, as I think I said in the summary I circulated, what makes a viable democratic environment. And that has to have something to do with what I called intellectual practice, I think.
Okay, so we're coming to the end, and I'll take Chair's prerogative to ask a question then. We talked a lot, David, you mentioned the point about the demographic challenge, the number of people coming up and how will we cope and what will universities do. But we think that there is only the model of the university, but of course a lot of people now are getting us to think about apprenticeships and won't there be a challenge about how we try as universities, not only about changing what we teach, but in terms of how we teach and with whom, because there were models. I know that I have colleagues that when I was at university who came up through the apprenticeship. They were working in building sciences and ended up becoming professors, but they would not have come through the traditional route, really. And I just wonder whether we've lost something, and perhaps one way to meet the challenge would be in alternative ways of people coming into education. Would either of you like to comment on that? Yeah.
Well, I do recognise that, and look, again, we mustn't be too pessimistic. I hear the pressures that OFS only has one model of success, but if you look at what's happening at London South Bank University, which is now incorporated in it an FE college, and because I'm reminded of that because you referred to building. South Bank University is probably London's centre of expertise on building, and putting up skyscrapers and blocks of flats in London, and they do very applied research on air conditioning systems, things like that. And they have close links to the building trade and want through their having an FE college as part of the wider university to incorporate that. So yes, and there are of course degree apprenticeships as well. The constraint, and I end up talking about finance because finance was the public policy lever that I was pulling. We were right to be reminded that there is more to life and there's more to universities than finance. But if you look at degree apprenticeships, the crucial question is, what is the financial model that funds them? And it is the apprenticeship levy, and the apprenticeship levy is now 99% spent. So growing degree apprenticeships is very hard to do. Despite all the controversy around it, at least a fees and loans model doesn't bring a supply constraint. Indeed, one of the big prizes we got from it was the Treasury removing controls on student numbers. So my view is that there is not yet a financing model for apprenticeships that offers the end of constraints on growth, because there's a limit to how much you can collect in the apprenticeship levy. And none of the advocates, including the ministers who are very keen, have yet shown to me how you could fund significant growth of that form of provision.
Just very briefly, I'd certainly welcome the diversity of routes in that you describe. And that's also why I'm interested in the history of those institutions over the last century and more that have tried to create new routes in for people who've missed out on the first round, so to speak, of their opportunity. Ruskin College in Oxford, or Lucy Cavendish in Cambridge, but loads more institutions across the country, which in various ways have attempted to do this, and the Open University. So there are levers, I think, that we can pull there. And part of what I had vaguely in mind in talking about the need for governance also to represent the wider educational ecology might factor that in as well. I was glad to hear you talk about the FEHE crossover, because again, something in South Wales we've been very interested in fostering.
So thank you very much, both David and Rowan, for a very interesting and stimulating debate. Thank you to the speakers in the earlier session. And it brings to a close our session of invited speakers.